I didn't lose my girlfriend in one day. I lost her the moment I agreed not to be the only one. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact evening everything started falling apart. But at the time I thought I was being mature, understanding, evolved. I thought I was saving our relationship. Instead, I was signing its death certificate with my own hand. Lena and I had been together for 3 years, living in a small apartment downtown, splitting bills, cooking dinners, talking about someday getting a dog. We had that comfortable rhythm couples fall into, where you know each other's coffee order and can finish each other's sentences. I genuinely believed we were building something permanent, something that would turn into marriage and kids and growing old together. She was smart, funny, ambitious, and I loved her in that deep, settled way where you stop questioning if this is the right person and just start planning the future. Then one evening in late spring, she came home from drinks with her friend Tissa, and I knew immediately something had shifted. She had this energy about her, this nervous excitement, like she'd been rehearsing something in her head the whole way home. We were sitting on our worn couch, the one we bought together at a thrift store when we first moved in, and she turned to me with this carefully casual expression. She started talking about honesty, about growth, about how relationships evolve, and I just sat there feeling my stomach drop because I knew whatever was coming wasn't good. Then she said it, the words that would change everything. I think we should open our relationship. Not as a question, not as a discussion, but as this idea she'd already fully formed in her mind. She explained it like she was presenting a business proposal, talking about how monogamy was just a social construct, how we could be honest about our needs, how this would actually make us stronger as a couple. She mentioned that Tissa and her boyfriend had been doing it for months and were happier than ever. I just stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. My first instinct was to say no, absolutely not, to tell her that's not what I wanted from our relationship. But then she looked at me with those eyes I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago, and I could see something behind the excitement, something that looked almost like a warning. It felt like she was saying this wasn't really a request, that if I said no, she might leave anyway. So instead of being honest about my feelings, I asked for time to think about it. She nodded, gave me space, but over the next few days she kept bringing it up gently, sharing articles about ethical non-monogamy, telling me stories about couples who made it work. There were no ultimatums, no threats, just this constant soft pressure that wore down my resistance like water on stone. I spent those days feeling sick, barely eating, going through my work on autopilot. My coworkers probably thought I had the flu. At night, I'd lie awake next to her, feeling the distance between us even though we were in the same bed. I kept thinking about all the years we'd invested, all the plans we'd made, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing her. I convinced myself that maybe this could work, that maybe I was being close-minded, that maybe love meant being flexible. So 1 week later, I told her yes. The relief on her face should have told me everything I needed to know, but I ignored it. We sat down and created rules, and I clung to those rules like they were a life raft. No one from work, because that's where boundaries get blurred. Protection always, no exceptions. Never in our apartment, because that was our sacred space. Complete transparency about who and when. Either of us could call it off at any time, no questions asked. She agreed to everything so easily, nodding along, and I felt like maybe we could actually navigate this. Maybe we really were evolved enough to make this work. The first time she went out to meet someone, I thought I might throw up. It was a Friday evening, and she got dressed carefully, not too sexy, but definitely making an effort. She kissed me goodbye like she was heading to the gym, casual and light, and told me she'd be back by 10. "It's just coffee," she said with a smile. I sat in our apartment after she left, and the silence was deafening. I tried watching TV, but I couldn't focus. I tried reading, but the words blurred together. I kept checking my phone, watching the minutes crawl by. She texted me once around 7 saying everything was fine, and I stared at that message for probably 10 minutes trying to decode what fine meant. I told myself this was just a phase, that she'd realize what we had was enough, that things would go back to normal soon. I poured myself a drink, then another, trying to quiet the voice in my head that was screaming this was all wrong. When she came home that night, she was glowing. She talked about the guy, Nate, how interesting he was, how easy the conversation flowed. I smiled and nodded and asked the right questions, playing the part of the supportive partner. But inside, something had fundamentally changed. I realized I'd agreed to this not because I wanted to explore or grow, but because I was terrified of losing her. And that fear, that willingness to compromise my own boundaries just to keep her, that was the crack in our foundation. Over the following weeks, she went out a few more times. Always with notice, always following the rules, always coming home to me. And I really tried to be okay with it. I even went on one date myself, met a woman at a bar, had a perfectly pleasant conversation, and felt absolutely nothing. It was mechanical, empty, like I was going through the motions of something I didn't actually want. When I got home that night, Lena asked how it went, and I could see she was relieved when I said it was just okay. That should have told me something too, but I wasn't ready to see it yet. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have predicted, was that the rules we'd so carefully constructed were only going to apply to one of us. I was still playing the game honestly, still believing in the framework we'd built. But Lena had already decided which rules mattered and which ones were just suggestions. And by the time I figured that out, I'd already lost something I could never get back. I told myself it was just a phase. I didn't know yet that this was the beginning of the end. The scariest thing about an open relationship isn't jealousy. It's the moment you realize the rules only exist for you. For the first 2 months after we opened things up, I kept telling myself we were navigating this together, that we were both being honest and respectful. But small things started changing, tiny shifts that I noticed but didn't want to acknowledge. Lena became distant in ways that had nothing to do with her seeing other people. We'd be sitting together watching a movie, and she'd be physically present but mentally somewhere else, her fingers moving across her phone screen with a small smile I didn't recognize. The touches became less frequent, the eye contact shorter, the conversations more surface level. It was like living with a roommate who used to be my girlfriend. She kept seeing Nate, the guy from that first coffee date, and she'd mention him casually like he was just another friend. Nate recommended this restaurant, or Nate told me about this hiking trail, and I'd just nod along, swallowing the bitter taste in my mouth. According to our rules, this was fine, this was allowed, this was healthy communication. But it didn't feel healthy. It felt like I was slowly being replaced in my own relationship. I tried going on a few more dates myself, thinking maybe I just needed to embrace this lifestyle more fully. I met people, had conversations, went through the motions. But every time, I'd come home feeling emptier than when I'd left. The apartment that used to feel like our sanctuary started feeling like a hotel, a place where 2 people happened to sleep in the same bed, but didn't really connect anymore. I'd lie awake at night next to her, feeling the physical warmth of her body, but the emotional coldness of the space between us, and I'd wonder how we'd gotten here so fast. Then around month 3, I started noticing things that made my stomach turn. Her phone, which used to sit casually on the coffee table, was now always face down. She'd get texts and immediately flip it over, or she'd take calls in the other room, her voice low and private. When I'd ask who it was, she'd give vague answers, just a friend, or work stuff, with a tone that discouraged follow-up questions. One evening about 4 months in, I asked her directly about transparency, reminding her that was one of our core agreements. She looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between annoyed and cornered. "You don't actually want to know all the details," she said, and it sounded almost accusatory, like I was the one breaking our agreement by asking. That's when I knew something had shifted fundamentally. The rules we'd created weren't guidelines for both of us anymore. They were restrictions that only applied to me. I was still following everything to the letter, still communicating, still being honest. But she'd decided that some rules were more like suggestions, and transparency was apparently optional when it became inconvenient. I started paying more attention, not because I wanted to be suspicious, but because I couldn't ignore the obvious anymore. She mentioned grabbing drinks with colleagues after work, but she'd come home with that same glowing energy she had after seeing Nate. She'd talk about team projects and late meetings, but her stories had holes in them, details that didn't quite line up. And then one evening, she casually mentioned a name I hadn't heard before. Derek, a guy from her office, someone on her team, someone she described as funny and smart and easy to talk to. My blood went cold. Our very first rule, the one we'd both agreed was non-negotiable, was no one from work. Work was supposed to be the boundary, the safe zone, the place where these complications couldn't reach. But here she was, mentioning this Derek guy with the same tone she used for Nate, like it was nothing, like our rules were just suggestions she could ignore when someone interesting came along. I didn't confront her right away because part of me didn't want to confirm what I was already suspecting, but I couldn't let it go either. Over the next 2 weeks, I started noticing patterns. She'd mention working late, but her car would be gone for hours longer than any meeting would take. She'd come home smelling different, wearing cologne I didn't recognize. She'd shower immediately, saying she needed to wash off the stress of the day, but it felt like she was washing off evidence. Then came a Saturday afternoon that changed everything. We were supposed to have lunch together, one of our standing weekend traditions that we'd been trying to maintain through all of this. She got a call, stepped into the bedroom, and I heard her voice through the door, low and intimate in a way she hadn't spoken to me in months. When she came out, she said it was Nate, that he was having a crisis and needed to talk. She'd be back in a couple hours. But something about the way she said it, the way she avoided my eyes, told me it wasn't Nate. I sat in that apartment after she left, and for the first time, I let myself feel the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't an open relationship. This was her wanting permission to do whatever she wanted while I sat at home following rules she'd abandoned. This was her having her cake and eating it too, keeping me as the stable home base while she explored without consequences. I'd been so afraid of losing her that I'd agreed to lose myself instead. When she came home that evening, I was waiting on the couch. I didn't yell, didn't accuse, just asked her a simple question. Are you seeing Derek? She froze, and I watched about 5 different emotions cross her face in 3 seconds. Then she sat down and tried to explain, tried to justify, tried to make it sound less bad than it was. She admitted they'd gotten close, that they'd grabbed drinks a few times after work, that it was just friendly at first. But the way she said it, the careful way she chose her words, told me there was more she wasn't saying. I pressed harder, asking directly if they'd crossed any lines. She hesitated, then admitted they'd kissed once. Just once, she said, and she'd felt terrible about it immediately. She swore that was all, that nothing else had happened, that she'd been planning to tell me. The lies were so smooth, so practiced, that I almost believed her. Almost. I looked at her sitting there, this woman I'd loved for 3 years, and I didn't recognize her anymore. Or maybe I finally recognized who she really was. If this is making us worse people, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, then we need to stop. All of it. She nodded quickly, tears forming in her eyes, and promised we would. She said she'd cut things off with Derek completely, that she'd recommit to us, that we could fix this. She reached for my hand, and I let her take it, even though it felt wrong. We agreed to close the relationship, to go back to just us, to try to rebuild what we'd lost. That night, lying in bed next to her, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that one conversation could fix months of lying and boundary crossing. But something in my gut told me the truth was worse than what she'd admitted. I just didn't know how much worse. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched her carefully. She said she'd ended things with Derek, that she'd been professional but clear. She showed me a text she'd supposedly sent him setting boundaries, and I nodded like that was enough. But I started noticing things that didn't add up. There were charges on our shared credit card from restaurants I'd never heard of. Always on nights, she claimed to be working late. I saw her phone light up once with a notification, just the letter D, before she swiped it away. She'd come home some evenings with that same distant look, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. I wanted to confront her again, to demand the full truth, but I was afraid of what I'd find. 3 years doesn't disappear in one conversation. We'd built a life together, shared lease, shared friends, shared dreams of a future. Walking away meant admitting I'd wasted 3 years on someone who never really loved me the way I loved her. So I stayed, telling myself maybe I was being paranoid, maybe I was looking for problems that weren't there. But deep down I knew. I knew she was still lying. I knew the story about just a kiss was bullshit. I knew Derek was still in the picture somehow. I just didn't have proof, and without proof, I couldn't bring myself to end it. I needed to know the full scope of the betrayal before I could walk away. Not because I thought we could fix it, but because I needed to understand who I'd been living with all this time. And the truth, when it finally came, was so much worse than I'd imagined. She wanted marriage the exact moment I realized I could never trust her again. Life has a cruel sense of timing like that. The truth came out not because she confessed, not because I finally confronted her properly, but because someone else decided I deserved to know. It was a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after our conversation about stopping, and I was at my desk at work when I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line just said, "You deserve to know the truth," and my hands were shaking as I opened it. The email was from Derek's wife. His wife. The guy Lena had been seeing, the co-worker she'd connected with, wasn't some single guy exploring anything. He was married with 2 kids, and his wife had just found everything. She'd attached screenshots, dozens of them, messages between Derek and Lena going back almost 5 months, way longer than the few drinks after work story Lena had sold me. I sat there reading through them in my cubicle, feeling my entire reality reshape itself with each swipe. The messages weren't just flirty or inappropriate. They were detailed planning of meetups, discussions of hotels, complaints about their respective partners. There was my name, been mentioned casually like I was an obstacle, an inconvenience they had to work around. One message from Lena, sent just 5 days ago, said she'd told me they'd only kissed once, followed by a laughing emoji. Another talked about how I was too trusting, too naive, and how easy it was to keep the lie going. She joked about how I'd bought the closing the relationship story completely, how I actually believed she'd cut him off. I closed my laptop before I could throw up at my desk. Derek's wife explained in her email that she'd discovered everything when she found a hotel receipt in his jacket pocket. She'd confronted him, he'd confessed to the affair, and she'd demanded access to his phone and laptop to see the full extent. She'd found Lena's information through his work contacts and decided I had a right to know what was really happening. She said she was filing for divorce and that HR at their company was already investigating because apparently there were policies against this kind of workplace relationship. She ended the email by saying she was sorry I had to find out this way, and that some people just don't deserve the trust we give them. I printed everything. Every screenshot, every message, every piece of evidence. The timeline alone was damning. Messages from nights she'd claimed to be working late, from afternoons she'd said she was running errands, from the very week we'd agreed to close things and work on us. I put it all in a manila folder and left work early, telling my boss I had a family emergency. In a way, I did. The family I thought I was building was disintegrating in real time, and I needed to face it head on. I didn't go home right away. I drove around for hours, just processing, just thinking. All those nights she'd come home late from work, all those showers immediately after walking in the door, all those face-down phones and private conversations, all those I love yous that she'd said while texting him behind my back. It hadn't been paranoia or insecurity. It had been reality, and I'd been too afraid to see it clearly. The just a kiss had been hotels and lies and an entire secret relationship that continued even after she'd promised to stop. When I finally went back to our apartment that evening, Lena was already home, cooking dinner like everything was normal. She smiled when I walked in, asked about my day, and I just stood there looking at her like she was a stranger. Because in many ways, she was. I didn't know this person who could lie so easily, who could betray agreements so casually, who could sleep next to me every night while maintaining an entire secret relationship. I told her we needed to talk, and I watched her face shift into that careful, prepared expression I'd seen too many times. We sat down at our small kitchen table, the same table where we'd had breakfast together 1,000 times, where we'd made plans and shared dreams. I pulled out the folder and placed it in front of her. I didn't say anything, just waited. She opened it, and I watched the color drain from her face as she flipped through the pages. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at evidence she couldn't deny or explain away. Then she started crying, those big dramatic tears that once would have broken my heart. She reached for my hand, and I pulled away. She tried to explain, saying it had gotten out of control, that she never meant for it to go this far, that Derek had pursued her, and she'd been confused, and she still loved me. She said the messages looked worse than they were, that she'd been venting frustrations but hadn't meant them, that the jokes about me were just her trying to fit in with what he wanted to hear. Then, and this part still amazes me when I think about it, she started talking about therapy. She said we could go to couples counseling, that we could work through this, that relationships go through rough patches and come out stronger. She talked about commitment and growth and all these buzzwords that meant nothing coming from someone who'd been lying to my face for 5 months straight. And then, as if the timing couldn't be more absurd, she started talking about marriage, about how maybe we'd been too casual about our relationship, how maybe we needed the structure of engagement to really commit to each other. She talked about starting a family, about how having kids would give us purpose and direction. She painted this whole picture of a future together, as if the past 5 months hadn't happened, as if I hadn't just discovered she'd been sleeping with a married man while telling me she loved me every single day. I let her finish. I let her say everything she needed to say, let her cry and plead and promise. And when she was done, when she finally ran out of words, I said the only thing that mattered. I don't see you as my wife anymore. The silence after those words was absolute. She stared at me like I'd slapped her, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She started to argue, to say that was extreme, that I was being unfair, that one mistake shouldn't define our entire relationship. But I just shook my head. It wasn't one mistake. It was 5 months of deliberate choices, 5 months of calculated lies, 5 months of disrespecting every boundary we'd ever established. It was looking me in the eye every single day while maintaining a relationship with a married man from her workplace, the one place that was supposed to be off limits. It was laughing about my trust with him, calling me naive, treating our relationship like it was a joke she and her affair partner shared. It was promising to stop and then continuing anyway, making me feel crazy for suspecting what was actually happening. That's not a mistake. That's a character revelation. I told her I was moving out, that I'd stay with my brother while I found a new place. She begged me to reconsider, to at least give her a chance to prove she could change. But I was done. I'd already given her too many chances, compromised too many of my own values, ignored too many red flags. I'd lost myself trying to keep her, and I needed to find that person again. The next few weeks were mechanical. I packed my stuff while she was at work, taking only what was clearly mine and leaving everything we'd bought together. I changed my number and only communicated through text on a new one I set up specifically for logistics. She tried calling my brother, messaging my friends, even showing up at my work once, but I'd already told everyone I needed space, and they helped me maintain it. Derek's wife followed through on her complaint to HR. The investigation revealed that their relationship had violated multiple company policies, and both Lena and Derek were let go. Lena lost her job, lost her portion of the rent on our apartment when I stopped contributing, and from what I heard through mutual friends, lost most of her social circle when the truth came out. Tissa, the friend who'd encouraged this whole open relationship idea, apparently distanced herself quickly when things got messy. I didn't take any pleasure in Lena's consequences. I didn't feel vindicated or satisfied watching her life fall apart. I just felt tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the drama, tired of trying to hold together something that had been broken from the moment she'd suggested opening our relationship. Because here's what I understood too late. She didn't suggest it for us. She suggested it for her. She already had Derek in mind. Maybe had already started something with him and wanted retroactive permission to continue. The open relationship was never about exploration or growth. It was about her wanting to have it all without facing any consequences. And when I agreed, when I compromised my own boundaries out of fear of losing her, I'd already lost. The relationship ended the moment I said yes to something I fundamentally didn't want. Everything after that was just the slow burn of something already dead. 6 months later, I'm in my own apartment, smaller than the one we shared but entirely mine. I'm rebuilding friendships I'd neglected, pursuing hobbies I'd abandoned, rediscovering who I am outside of that relationship. I don't hate Lena. I don't wish bad things for her. I just hope she figures out whatever was broken inside her that made her think that behavior was acceptable. As for me, I learned an expensive lesson about boundaries and self-respect. I learned that love without trust isn't love at all. It's just fear dressed up in romantic language. I learned that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time. I learned that sometimes the person asking you to compromise everything is the same person willing to compromise nothing. She thought she was opening our relationship, but really, she closed the door on our future. And the scariest part is that I agreed to it all because I loved her. But love shouldn't mean losing yourself. And I'll never make that mistake again. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.